South African fathers are striving to be more productive fathers than their own dads. That's according to the 2021 State of South Africa's Father Report released today. The study shows that more men are taking up roles and responsibilities of fatherhood and want to be involved in their children's lives. Let's unpack these findings with Wessel from Sonke Gender Justice. Wessel, very good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. So your report or your research found or highlights that the positive father involvement in South Africa, this really goes against what the norm or what we think of South African fathers.
Exactly, Tony. So this report is really exciting because it contains findings from a first-of-a-kind survey that actually looked at what is the involvement that fathers are having with their children. So whereas previously we only had statistics about whether men were living in the same household as a child or not, or in fact whether fathers were living in the same household as a child or not, we now actually have some numbers from a dedicated survey that actually tell us what fathers are doing with children. Things like homework, caring for the child, walking to school, etc. And the report goes into quite a lot of depth with some of these findings.
Okay, so how big was your sample size and what sort of questions were you asking?
So this survey we're quite clear to say it's a non-probability sample. So in other words, it's not yet representative. Hopefully our next iteration in 2024 will be iterative. But it was quite a big sample. It was 1,003 fathers. And we asked questions about involvement in childcare. We asked questions about income. We have a chapter on fathers' own mental health. We have a chapter on experiences of violence or their own exposure and witnessing of violence. And, one of the key chapters is about what we call social fatherhood. In other words, the men who are not biologically related to children, but are fulfilling some kind of a father figure role or a caring role. And I think that was so exciting about the findings from the report, is that we could see that for those men who answered that they are fulfilling some kind of a social fatherhood role, their involvement was quite close to the involvement of biological fathers. And that's really encouraging, because we often think that, it's only the biological father who can be the one who steps in and takes care of the child. But in fact, there are actually other men around that are playing a very valuable role in children's lives.
So were you finding that this, men are now seeing that it's not just about material things, it's not just about, listen, I sent my kid to school, that's all I need to do. It's also about being there for the child emotionally. Did that come across?
Yes. Exactly. So until now, we haven't had much data about that. We didn't really know beyond the financial support and the presence of children at this scale what were fathers actually doing. And the idea that a father is a provider and provides financial support is a key idea around fatherhood. Most fathers feel financially responsible for their children. And that while that is an important role, it's often quite limiting because fathers feel, well, as long as I pay the school fees, I'm done. But what we are seeing from these respondents is that they think about fatherhood in a much broader range of activities, not only financial support. And that's really encouraging.
I mean, it really is encouraging. And just to go back to, the point you just made here about that some of the respondents were not the actual biological fathers. And looking at the numbers here, you're saying most children in South Africa live with men as well. I mean, I always thought that, the general view was that, most children live with single mums.
Exactly. So what the census tells us, the General Household Survey, is that most children, the parent that they live with is their biological mother. But what we often overlook is that most families are extended families. And in those extended families, there are other adult men that can fulfill a caring role. So while most children do not live with their own biological father, there are other men in those households. And until now, we didn't really know what they did, or whether they had a positive impact on the child or a negative impact on the child. And to be clear, we still don't know. We just know from the sample. But what we're seeing from this sample is quite encouraging.
Okay, so it is encouraging, but what is a long-term view? I mean, what do you aim to achieve here by doing such research?
So what we envision is especially a policy and a structural support for fathers' contribution to care work. That's where we want to go to. And by doing these reports every 3 years, we actually now have a tracking mechanism so that we can see if fatherhood is improving or not, if especially the involvement of fathers in children's lives is improving or not. So that in the year 2030, 2035, we can go back to Parliament and say, yes, parental leave is working. Yes, the child support grant is working for fathers who are using that. The idea is that this research informs our policy and practice in making sure that men are not let off the hook in terms of their responsibility of providing care to their families.
I just in my intro, just before we started talking, we spoke about the fact that men are now looking, at the past and saying, "I want to be better than my father was," almost saying, "You know what? It's time to break the cycle." Am I correct to say that?
Yes, of course. We have in some of the educational work that Sonke Gender Justice does in parenting groups under the Men Care program, we ask this question: what do you want to repeat that your father did? And what do you want to change, or what do you want to do differently? And we often hear that fathers say, quite two very different things. On the one hand, you'll have many fathers say, my father was present, he was involved, I want to offer my children the same thing. But then very often we hear on the other side, my father was either violent or absent or not involved at all. Because of that, I also want to be much more involved with my children. I never want to be like my dad. And that's in lots of studies around fatherhood, not only in South Africa, but around the world, we see this reaction in terms of what we call the intergenerational transfer of care, that men say, I want to be different than my dad, or in the positive cases, I actually want to keep on doing what he is doing.
And also just, again, to what we all think about South African fathers is that, in terms of, he's not there, or it's single mothers raising kids and so forth. But surely there's an element of some fathers just don't have access to their children, just are not allowed to see their kids. Did you ask questions like that as well?
Yes, we did. And, that's often quite a contentious topic, especially when one starts to talk about custody and maintenance and, whether fathers are supporting their children financially if they're no longer living with them. What was really interesting from the survey was that when we asked fathers who lived separately from their children, what were the reasons that you do not see your child? The first reason was that I live too far. So I think we're still seeing the effect of the unfortunate history of the country where migrant labor was established, so that a father needs to go and earn an income elsewhere and then send money back home, whether he's still in a relationship with a mother or not. So that was the top reason. And then the second reason was, that there was conflict in the family, or that there was conflict with the mother. But it was really also interesting, often we hear that the main reason is that the mother is blocking access. And in fact, when we looked at the data, the main reason was actually distance. And I wanted to come back to something about the single mother, or at least the female-headed households, Tony. it's really clear in our low-income groups in South Africa that most children in low-income groups do not live in the same household as their biological father. But what you see as you go up the income groups and you get to the middle class and even the higher income quintile is that co-residence between fathers and children increases. So, earlier this year we had some media exposure that was quite focused on the fact that most black families in South Africa do not have fathers and children living in the same household. And what this data about the income quintiles tells us is actually that it's not so much about race. That's very much still a legacy issue from the past of South Africa. Co-residence between a biological father and a child is much more connected to income and class. So, if you look at employed fathers, 90% of employed fathers live with their children. It's much more about whether families actually have the means to live together than whether it's connected to some kind of cultural imperative.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Thank you so much, Wessel van den Berg, there for talking to us, speaking to us about the research there done by the Sonke Gender Justice